You're standing on a weathered dock as the sun sets over a Caribbean harbor. The air is thick with salt and the smell of tar from ship repairs. In the distance, you hear the creak of wooden hulls, the snap of canvas sails, and voices calling in a dozen different languages. A ship glides into port, its black flag barely visible in the fading light. For a moment, you wonder what stories that vessel carries, what treasures lie in its hold, and what kind of people choose a life beyond the reach of any nation's law. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet, where we explore fascinating stories designed to ease you gently into sleep. Wherever you are right now, I'm so glad you've decided to join me for tonight's adventure. Tonight, we're setting sail into one of history's most romanticized, yet misunderstood subjects: pirates. Not the swashbuckling heroes of Hollywood or the cartoonish villains of children's tales, but the real people who chose the sea over society, freedom over security, and the uncertain promise of fortune over the grinding poverty of ordinary life. So settle into your most comfortable position, let your breathing deepen, and join me as we journey through centuries of salt spray and adventure. Our story begins not in the Caribbean, but thousands of years earlier, when the first humans realized that the sea could be both highway and hunting ground. Long before Blackbeard ever sailed the Caribbean or Captain Kidd was hanged in London, before the Jolly Roger flew over any mast, piracy was already an ancient profession. The moment humans learned to build boats capable of crossing open water, some of them realized that other people's boats carried valuable cargo. Piracy and maritime trade emerged together, twins born from humanity's relationship with the sea. The earliest written reference to pirates comes from ancient Egypt, around 1350 BCE. Pharaoh Akhenaten's records mention the Lucca, sea raiders from the Anatolian coast who attacked Egyptian and Syrian coastal settlements. These weren't organized navies or even particularly large groups, but they were effective enough to warrant mention in royal archives. They represented a problem that would plague every seafaring civilization for the next 3,000 years. How do you protect ships and coastal settlements from people who can strike from the sea and disappear back into it? The ancient Greeks knew pirates well. In Homer's Odyssey, written around 800 BCE, Odysseus himself sometimes claims to be a pirate when he wants to disguise his identity. This wasn't considered particularly shameful in the narrative, which tells us something about how Greeks viewed piracy. It was dangerous, certainly, and victims didn't appreciate it, but it wasn't seen as fundamentally different from any other form of raiding or warfare. When resources were scarce and might made right, taking what you needed from those weaker than you was simply how the world worked. The Mediterranean Sea, with its many islands, hidden coves, and busy trade routes, was perfect pirate territory. Ancient pirates would base themselves on small, rocky islands that were difficult to attack, but provided excellent views of passing ships. They'd wait for merchant vessels, preferably ones that appeared poorly defended, then row out in fast galleys to overtake them. The goal was usually to capture cargo, and sometimes the ship itself, though taking captives for ransom or slavery was also profitable. One of the most famous incidents of ancient piracy involved a young Julius Caesar. In 75 BCE, while traveling to Rhodes to study philosophy and rhetoric, Caesar's ship was captured by Cilician pirates. These particular pirates were notorious throughout the Mediterranean, operating from bases along the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum. Caesar, even as a captive, was reportedly insulted by this amount. He told his captors they clearly didn't understand who they'd captured and insisted they demand 50 talents instead. During the 38 days it took to raise this ransom, Caesar apparently treated his captivity as an amusing interlude. He participated in the pirates' games and exercises, wrote poetry which he recited to them, and when they didn't appreciate his verses, called them illiterate barbarians to their faces. He joked that after his release, he would return and have them all crucified. The pirates, amused by their confident young captive, laughed at this threat. They shouldn't have. Once Caesar was released and the ransom paid, he immediately raised a small fleet, returned to the pirates' base, captured the entire crew, and recovered his ransom money. True to his word, he had them all crucified, though as a mercy, because they'd treated him relatively well during captivity. He had their throats cut first, so they wouldn't suffer the prolonged agony of crucifixion. This story, whether entirely true or embellished, illustrates both the prevalence of piracy in the ancient world and the eventual response of organized states to the problem. The Roman Republic eventually decided that Mediterranean piracy had become too disruptive to trade. In 67 BCE, they gave Pompey the great extraordinary powers to deal with the pirate problem. Pompey was granted command of the entire Mediterranean and all coastlines up to 50 miles inland, along with massive resources in ships and men. His campaign was remarkably effective. Within 3 months, he'd cleared the western Mediterranean of pirates. Within 3 more months, he'd attacked the main pirate bases in Cilicia and effectively ended organized piracy in the region. But Pompey's success came partly from his strategy of offering terms to pirates who surrendered. Rather than simply executing captured pirates, he offered them land and the opportunity to settle as farmers. Many accepted, understanding that piracy's golden age in the Mediterranean was ending. This pragmatic approach recognized something important. Pirates weren't monsters, but people responding to economic and political circumstances. Given better options, many chose to stop pirating. Yet piracy never truly disappeared. It simply moved to new waters and took new forms. As Rome's power waned and eventually collapsed, piracy returned to the Mediterranean. During the medieval period, the distinction between pirate and legitimate naval force became increasingly blurred. When the Western Roman Empire fell and centralized authority fragmented, the line between raiding, warfare, and piracy became almost meaningless. The Vikings, who began their raids in the late 8th century, were essentially pirates, though we rarely call them that. They were seafaring raiders who struck coastal settlements, took what they wanted, and disappeared back across the sea. Their longships were perfectly designed for this purpose. Shallow draft allowed them to navigate rivers and land on beaches, while their speed and seaworthiness made them effective for surprise attacks. A Viking raid followed the same basic pattern as ancient Greek piracy. Identify wealthy targets, attack quickly, take valuable goods and captives, and escape before organized resistance could form. The Viking raids weren't just robbery, though. They represented a sophisticated response to land scarcity and political consolidation in Scandinavia. As populations grew and powerful rulers consolidated control, younger sons and displaced families had limited options. Raiding offered opportunity for wealth and glory that wasn't available at home. Over time, raiding evolved into trading, settling, and eventually integration with the peoples they'd once terrorized. The Normans, who would conquer England in 1066, were descendants of Vikings who'd settled in northern France. In the Mediterranean, a different kind of piracy emerged during the medieval and early modern period. The Barbary corsairs, operating from North African ports like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, were officially sanctioned by the Ottoman Empire and the various Muslim states that controlled North Africa. These weren't outlaws, but privateers operating under state authority. Their primary targets were Christian ships and coastal settlements, and they justified their actions as part of the broader conflict between Christian and Muslim powers. The Barbary corsairs' most notorious practice was capturing people for the slave trade. Entire villages in coastal Spain, Italy, and even distant Ireland and Iceland were raided, with inhabitants carried off to North African slave markets. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, possibly more than 1 million Europeans were enslaved by Barbary corsairs. This traumatic history deeply affected European perceptions of piracy and shaped the aggressive anti-piracy policies that European nations would later pursue. What's important to understand about ancient and medieval piracy is that it existed in a very different legal and moral framework than we might expect. Pirates weren't always criminals in the modern sense. When caught, they might be executed brutally, but they might also be offered terms, recruited into naval service, or even celebrated if they'd been raiding enemy ships. The distinction between pirate, privateer, and naval officer was often just a matter of perspective and political convenience. By the late medieval period, as European nations began exploring and exploiting the Americas, the stage was being set for what would become piracy's most famous era. The vast wealth flowing from the New World to the Old, the weak control European powers had over Caribbean waters, and the constant warfare between European nations would create perfect conditions for a new generation of sea raiders. These wouldn't be Vikings or Barbary corsairs, but something new. The pirates of the Caribbean, whose brief but spectacular reign would define piracy in popular imagination forever. The story of Caribbean piracy begins not with pirates, but with pigs. In the early 1600s, the island of Hispaniola, now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was officially Spanish territory. But Spain's focus was on the gold and silver of Mexico and Peru. They couldn't adequately defend or administer all the Caribbean islands they claimed, and many territories were only nominally under Spanish control. On the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, feral pigs descended from escaped Spanish livestock roamed freely, and European sailors discovered they could hunt these pigs for meat. The men who came to hunt these pigs were deserters from European ships, castaways, escaped indentured servants, and people fleeing various troubles. They lived rough lives, hunting pigs and preserving the meat using a Caribbean indigenous technique called boucan, which involved smoking meat over a low fire. The French called these men Buccaneers, which became Buccaneers in English. They sold their smoked meat to passing ships, lived in temporary camps, and existed entirely outside any government's control. Spanish authorities, annoyed by these squatters on what they considered Spanish land, attempted to eliminate them by killing all the pigs. This 1630s campaign succeeded in destroying the Buccaneers' food source, but it had an unintended consequence. The hunters, now unable to make a living hunting pigs, turned to hunting something else: Spanish ships. The Buccaneers became pirates, and their transformation would change Caribbean history. The island of Tortuga, a small rocky island off Hispaniola's northern coast, became the first major Buccaneer base. It was perfect for their purposes, difficult to attack due to its rocky coastline and defensible positions, but close to major Spanish shipping lanes. The Buccaneers fortified Tortuga and used it as a base for raids against Spanish commerce. They weren't particularly sophisticated or organized at first, but they were desperate, skilled with weapons, and intimately familiar with Caribbean waters. European governments, particularly France and England, recognized an opportunity. Spain claimed vast territories in the Americas, but couldn't effectively control all of them. If Buccaneers were going to raid Spanish ships anyway, why not give them official sanction? This is where the system of privateering became crucial to piracy's golden age. A privateer held a letter of marque from a government, giving them legal authority to attack that nation's enemies. In practice, this meant European nations could wage economic warfare against Spain without committing their own navies. Buccaneers with letters of marque could attack Spanish ships and settlements legally, at least from their sponsoring nation's perspective. They'd keep most of the treasure they captured, while the government received a percentage, and achieved its strategic goal of weakening Spain. This system created a legally ambiguous space where piracy and legitimate warfare overlapped. A captain with an English letter of marque was a legal privateer when attacking Spanish ships, but became a pirate if he attacked French or Dutch vessels. Many captains carried multiple letters of marque from different nations, switching allegiances as convenient. And when European nations made peace with each other, they'd cancel letters of marque, expecting privateers to suddenly stop raiding. This rarely worked well. The Buccaneers developed a distinctive culture during the mid-17th century. They formed loose brotherhoods, sharing provisions and profits according to agreed-upon rules. They were remarkably diverse, including English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, African, and indigenous Caribbean people. Class and nationality mattered less in Buccaneer society than competence and courage. This wasn't because Buccaneers were enlightened about equality, but because they needed every capable person they could get and couldn't afford the rigid hierarchies of European society. Henry Morgan exemplifies the ambiguous status of Buccaneers during this period. Born in Wales around 1635, Morgan came to the Caribbean as a young man and rose through Buccaneer ranks through a combination of courage, cunning, and ruthlessness. He led increasingly ambitious raids against Spanish settlements, including attacks on Portobelo, Maracaibo, and ultimately Panama City in 1671. Which he sacked despite strict orders from England not to attack Spanish territory while peace negotiations were ongoing. Morgan's Panama raid was a military success but a political disaster. The treaty between England and Spain had been signed before the attack, though Morgan claimed not to have known this. Spain demanded his punishment. The English government arrested Morgan and brought him to London for trial. But Morgan had powerful friends. Public opinion viewed him as a hero who'd struck against Catholic Spain, and the political winds shifted. Instead of being executed, Morgan was knighted and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica, tasked with suppressing the very piracy he'd once practiced. Morgan's career illustrated the thin line between pirate and respectable official. His transformation from buccaneer to knight wasn't unusual. Many successful pirates eventually accepted pardons and retired to legitimate lives, sometimes even joining anti-piracy efforts. The most successful pirates weren't those who died in battle or on the gallows, but those who quit while they were ahead and lived to spend their plunder. Port Royal in Jamaica became the most famous buccaneer haven during the late 17th century. At its height in the 1660s to 1680s, Port Royal was one of the wealthiest and most dissolute cities in the Caribbean. Buccaneers would arrive after successful raids with holds full of Spanish silver and gold, and the city's merchants, tavern keepers, and various entertainers were ready to help them spend it. Contemporary accounts describe Port Royal as the richest and wickedest city in the world, where money flowed freely and conventional morality was largely ignored. The city's prosperity depended entirely on the Buccaneers' raids. Merchants would buy captured goods at a fraction of their value, ship them to other markets, and make enormous profits. Taverns, brothels, and gambling houses catered to pirates with money to spend and short life expectancies. The whole economy was built on stolen Spanish gold, and everyone from the humblest tavern server to the royal governor benefited from this arrangement. But Port Royal's golden age ended catastrophically on June 7, 1692, when a massive earthquake struck Jamaica. The city, built partly on unconsolidated sand, experienced soil liquefaction during the quake. Buildings collapsed, entire streets sank into the sea, and a tsunami struck shortly after. An estimated 2,000 people died in the initial disaster, and many more from injuries and disease in the following weeks. Contemporary preachers called it divine judgment on a wicked city, and while the earthquake had perfectly natural causes, its timing seemed almost too appropriate. Port Royal was rebuilt, but it never regained its former prominence. More importantly for our story, by the 1690s, the political situation that had made buccaneering profitable was changing. European nations were increasingly making peace with each other and with Spain. They no longer wanted private raiders destabilizing their diplomatic relationships. The age of the buccaneers was ending, but piracy wasn't. It was simply entering a new phase. The transition from privateering to pure piracy happened gradually during the 1690s and early 1700s. When nations signed peace treaties and canceled letters of marque, they expected privateers to retire. But many of these men had spent years, even decades, making their living by raiding ships. They had few skills applicable to legitimate work. They developed a taste for the freedom and potential wealth piracy offered, and they faced grim economic prospects in the legitimate world. So they simply continued pirating, now without legal cover. This new generation of pirates, operating in the early 18th century, represents what we call the golden age of piracy. They weren't buccaneers with government backing, but outlaws operating outside all national systems. They developed their own codes, elected their own leaders, and created floating communities that existed apart from any nation's laws. They were, in a real sense, some of history's first true anarchists, and their brief flowering between roughly 1715 and 1725 would create the pirate legends that still captivate us today. One of the most surprising aspects of pirate society, and one that often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings, was how remarkably democratic and egalitarian it was. At a time when European society was rigidly hierarchical, when naval ships operated under brutal discipline, and when ordinary seamen had virtually no rights, pirate ships functioned as floating democracies with social contracts that would have impressed political philosophers. These weren't written constitutions in the modern sense, but rather agreed-upon articles that each crew member would sign or make their mark upon before a voyage. These pirate codes varied from ship to ship, but they shared common elements that reveal a sophisticated understanding of how to organize a community where violent men needed to cooperate despite having no external authority to enforce order. Let's look at some actual pirate articles that have survived. Captain Bartholomew Roberts' ship articles from the 1720s are among the most complete examples we have. Article 1 stated that every man had an equal vote in affairs of the moment and equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquor seized. This wasn't just rhetoric. Pirates genuinely practiced one-person, one-vote democracy in a way that wouldn't become common in mainstream society for another century. Article 2 established that every man would be called fairly in turn by the list on board of prizes. But if they defrauded the company to the value of even $1 in plate, jewels, or money, their punishment was marooning. This addressed the fundamental challenge of pirate society. How do you prevent theft within a community of thieves? The answer was transparency and severe punishment for anyone who tried to cheat their crewmates. Roberts' articles included surprisingly progressive disability compensation. If a man lost a limb or became otherwise injured in the service of the ship, he would receive compensation from the common fund. 800 pieces of 8 for loss of a right arm, 600 for the left arm, 600 for the right leg, 500 for the left leg, 100 for an eye or finger. This was workers' compensation insurance 2 centuries before it became standard in legitimate industry. Pirates understood that men wouldn't risk their lives without knowing their families would be provided for if they were killed or maimed. The articles also restricted captains' authority in interesting ways. While the captain had absolute authority during battle or chase, at all other times, the crew made decisions collectively. The captain ate the same food as the crew, couldn't claim special accommodations, and could be voted out of his position if the crew lost confidence in him. This was a radical departure from naval or merchant vessels, where captains wielded nearly absolute power and often lived in luxury while their crews suffered. Musicians on pirate ships received an interesting exemption. Article 4 of Roberts' articles stated that musicians could rest on the Sabbath, but on other days only by favor. This seems almost comically specific until you understand that musicians were valuable crew members. They provided entertainment during long voyages helped coordinate work with rhythmic music and could lift morale during difficult times. The fact that they got one guaranteed day off per week was actually a privilege on a pirate ship. Gambling was often regulated or forbidden in pirate articles. Roberts prohibited playing cards or dice for money, recognizing that gambling created conflicts that could tear crews apart. Other captains allowed gambling but limited the stakes. Pirates understood that poverty and desperation had driven many of them to piracy in the first place, and they didn't want their crewmates driven to desperation again by losing all their shares to gambling. The treatment of prisoners and captured ships was also often specified. Some articles required that prisoners be treated humanely, while others prohibited the company from taking women aboard as prisoners. This latter rule existed not from any enlightened views about preventing assault, but because pirates recognized that women prisoners would create conflicts among the crew. Some pirate captains strictly enforced rules against sexual violence, understanding that such behavior would destroy crew cohesion. The election of pirate captains deserves special attention. On naval vessels, captains were appointed by Admiralty and held their positions regardless of crew opinion. On pirate ships, the crew elected their captain and could remove him through vote if he proved incompetent or tyrannical. Some pirates went through multiple captains during a single voyage, democratically replacing leaders who lost their confidence. This didn't mean pirate captains were weak or ineffective. During battle, a pirate captain had absolute authority. Disobeying orders during combat could result in immediate execution. This made sense. Naval battles required coordinated action and instant obedience. Democratic debate during combat would get everyone killed. But once the fighting ended, the captain's authority reverted to that of a first among equals. The quartermaster position on pirate ships was equally important as the captain, and in some ways more powerful. The quartermaster was also elected by the crew and served as a check on the captain's power. He distributed provisions, settled disputes between crew members, and determined each man's share of plunder. The quartermaster often led boarding parties during attacks, while the captain directed the overall battle from the ship. The distribution of plunder followed elaborate formulas designed to be perceived as fair. Common shares went to ordinary crew members, while the captain might receive 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5 shares, and skilled positions like carpenter, gunner, or surgeon received slightly more than ordinary sailors. This was far more egalitarian than legitimate shipping, where captains and officers claimed the vast majority of any profits, while common sailors received pittances. Pirates also practiced a form of social insurance beyond just injury compensation. If a pirate's portion of plunder was lost or stolen through no fault of his own, the company would often make it good from common funds. If a man died, his share would be sent to his family if possible, or distributed among the crew if he had no heirs. These practices created genuine community and loyalty among men who had often been treated as disposable by legitimate society. The pirate code's success in creating functional communities shouldn't be overstated. These were still violent, criminal organizations. The democracy only extended to crew members. Captured sailors and passengers had no rights. The egalitarianism existed alongside brutal punishments for those who broke the code. Marooning, where a man was left alone on an island with minimal supplies, was essentially a death sentence, but avoided the bad luck pirates associated with killing crewmates aboard ship. Still, the contrast with legitimate maritime society was stark. A naval sailor in the early 18th century could be press-ganged into service against his will, flogged for minor infractions, fed rotting food while officers dined well, receive no compensation for injuries, and be discharged without pay if the ship's voyage ended early. A merchant sailor was only marginally better off, often cheated of wages by unscrupulous captains, working in dangerous conditions without any safety net. Compared to these options, piracy offered something remarkable: a voice in decision-making, a fair share of rewards, compensation for injuries, and treatment as a valued member of a community rather than expendable labor. For men at the bottom of society's hierarchy, men who'd been soldiers, sailors, or slaves, the pirate code offered something they'd rarely experienced: dignity and agency. This doesn't excuse piracy's violence or theft, but it helps explain why men chose it. The pirate code wasn't just about organizing criminal enterprise efficiently. It was about creating a society that treated its members better than legitimate society did. For a brief period in the early 18th century, the most democratic, egalitarian communities in the Atlantic world were floating on pirate ships, governed by social contracts that recognized every man's equal worth. When governments eventually suppressed piracy, they eliminated these floating republics and forced men back into societies where they had no voice and few rights. Some historians argue that pirate democracy influenced later revolutionary movements, that sailors who'd experienced self-governance on pirate ships carried those ideas back to shore. Whether or not pirates directly influenced democratic revolutions, they proved that ordinary men could govern themselves effectively, and that message was dangerous to the hierarchical societies of the 18th century. The romantic image of pirate life tends to focus on dramatic battles, discovered treasure, and wild celebration in port. But most of a pirate's life was actually quite mundane, consisting of the same routine tasks that occupied sailors on any ship: maintaining the vessel, standing watch, managing provisions, and dealing with the peculiar challenges of living in a wooden box that floated on salt water. Let's explore what daily life was actually like for pirates during the Golden Age. First, the ship itself required constant maintenance. Wooden ships in tropical waters faced continuous threats from rot, shipworms, and the simple wear of waves and weather. Sailors spent huge amounts of time on maintenance, caulking seams with oakum and tar to prevent leaks, scraping and scrubbing decks to prevent rot, checking rigging for wear, and repairing sails. Every few months, a ship needed to be careened, beached or hauled up so the hull could be cleaned of barnacles and marine growth that slowed the vessel. Careening was one of piracy's most vulnerable moments. The ship would be deliberately grounded at high tide, then as the tide went out, it would list to one side. The crew would scrape the exposed hull, repair damage, and apply pitch or tallow to protect the wood. Then they'd wait for the next high tide, refloat the ship, and repeat the process for the other side. During careening, the ship couldn't move quickly, and the crew was divided between those working on the hull and those standing guard. Many pirate ships were captured or attacked during careening operations. The daily routine aboard a pirate ship followed patterns similar to any sailing vessel. The day was divided into watches, with different portions of the crew responsible for sailing the ship during each period. The night was divided into shorter watches, because sailing at night required more vigilance and frequent course corrections. Being on watch meant being responsible not just for steering and managing sails, but for spotting other ships, watching for weather changes, and identifying any problems with the vessel. Food was a constant concern and often a major motivation for piracy. Long-term food preservation in the 18th century was difficult. Ships carried hardtack, which was flour and water baked into rock-hard biscuits that could last months, but often became infested with weevils. Salted meat, usually pork or beef, could last weeks but became increasingly unpalatable. Dried peas and beans provided protein. Ships sometimes carried live animals, usually chickens or goats, which provided fresh meat and eggs while they lasted. Fresh water was precious. It was stored in wooden casks, and on long voyages, it would become stagnant and foul-tasting. Sailors learned to hold their noses while drinking it or mix it with rum or beer to mask the taste. Beer was actually considered a provision rather than a luxury, because it stayed drinkable longer than water. The daily ration of rum or beer was something sailors looked forward to, providing both refreshment and a brief escape from their circumstances. Pirates actively sought fresh provisions whenever possible. This often meant raiding ships not for their gold, but for their food, water, and medical supplies. A well-stocked merchant vessel might be carrying salted fish, cheese, flour, butter, vegetables, fruit, wine, and other provisions that would be far more valuable to pirates than money in the short term. Many pirate attacks were essentially grocery raids, with the pirates taking food and leaving the ship's actual cargo alone. When pirates captured ships near land, they'd often send parties ashore to hunt, gather fruit, and refill water casks. The Caribbean islands had wild pigs and cattle descended from European livestock. Tropical fruits like mangoes, guavas, and plantains could be gathered from coastal areas. Fresh food was crucial not just for taste, but for health. Sailors on long voyages without fresh food developed scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that caused teeth to fall out, wounds not to heal, and eventually death. Disease was a constant threat. Ships were perfect environments for spreading illness, dozens of men living in close quarters, sharing water from the same buckets, sleeping in damp spaces with poor air circulation. Dysentery, typhoid, and various fevers killed more sailors than combat did. Pirates who captured ships with sick crew members might deliberately avoid close contact, or even let the ship go rather than risk infection. Personal hygiene on pirate ships was limited by circumstance. Fresh water was too precious to waste on bathing. Some sailors would bathe in seawater, though this left salt residue that could cause skin irritation. Clothes were washed occasionally in seawater and spread on deck to dry. Most pirates probably smelled terrible by modern standards, though everyone smelled terrible in the 18th century, so it was relatively less noticeable. The sleeping arrangements varied by ship size and configuration. On larger vessels, some pirates might sling hammocks below deck. Others would sleep on deck when weather permitted. Space was cramped, and privacy was nearly non-existent. This close living meant that personality conflicts could escalate quickly, which is one reason pirate codes had detailed rules about settling disputes. Entertainment during long voyages was crucial for maintaining morale. Musicians, as mentioned earlier, were valuable crew members. They might have fiddles, pipes, or drums and would play for dancing and singing. Pirates sang work songs while performing coordinated tasks like raising anchors or adjusting sails, using rhythm to coordinate their efforts. Card games, dice, and storytelling helped pass the time, though gambling was regulated to prevent conflicts. Superstitions were taken seriously. Many pirates believed in signs and omens. A black cat aboard was often considered good luck. Starting a voyage on a Friday was unlucky. Killing an albatross would bring disaster. These superstitions seem quaint now, but for men whose lives depended on wind, weather, and fortune, they provided a sense of control over uncontrollable circumstances. Navigation required skill and experience. Pirates needed to know how to use navigational instruments like the compass, cross staff, or quadrant, and eventually the sextant. They had to be able to read charts, understand tides and currents, and recognize coastal landmarks. The best pirate captains were excellent navigators who could find their way across open ocean to specific islands, or predict where merchant ships would be based on trade wind patterns. Watches for other ships were constant. A lookout stationed at the highest point of the mast would watch the horizon for sails. Identifying a ship at a distance required experience. Was it a merchant vessel worth pursuing? A naval ship to avoid? Another pirate who might be friendly or hostile? These decisions had to be made quickly because once ships spotted each other, the faster vessel had the advantage. Medical care on pirate ships was primitive, but sometimes better than on naval vessels. Some pirates had experience with basic medical treatment from their time in navies or merchant marines. Serious wounds were often fatal due to infection. Amputations were performed to prevent gangrene, with the patient given rum for anesthesia and a leather strap to bite on. The surgeon, if the ship had one, also might serve as the barber, since both professions involved sharp instruments and knowledge of the human body. Pirates often suffered from tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever. They had no understanding of germ theory or how diseases spread. They attributed illness to bad air, spoiled food, or divine punishment. The best they could do was quarantine sick crew members and hope the illness didn't spread. In reality, Caribbean waters were incredibly dangerous disease environments, and even successful pirates often died of fever rather than combat. Despite these challenges, many men chose pirate life over legitimate alternatives. Yes, it was dangerous, uncomfortable, and often boring. But it offered freedom from oppressive hierarchy, fair compensation, democratic decision-making, and the possibility, however remote, of capturing a prize that would make everyone wealthy. For men who'd experienced the brutal discipline of naval service or the exploitation of merchant shipping, pirate life, for all its hardships, represented an improvement. The daily reality of pirate life wasn't particularly romantic or exciting. It was hard work, constant maintenance, long periods of searching for targets, and brief moments of terror during storms or combat. But it was also a life lived on one's own terms, governed by rules one had a voice in creating, among companions who treated each other as equals. For the brief period when piracy flourished, it offered something rare in the 18th century, a life of possibility for men who otherwise had none. Let's address the most persistent pirate myth immediately: buried treasure. Despite centuries of treasure hunting and countless stories about pirates burying their loot, there's almost no historical evidence that pirates regularly buried treasure. Of thousands of documented pirates during the Golden Age, we have confirmed records of exactly one who buried treasure: William Kidd, and he only did it because he was desperately trying to use it as a bargaining chip while negotiating with authorities. The reason pirates didn't bury treasure is simple: they needed money. Pirates were essentially maritime robbers who wanted to spend what they stole. Burying gold on a remote island and drawing a map to find it later makes for great fiction, but in reality, pirates wanted to sail into port and convert their plunder into rum, food, new clothes, gambling opportunities, and whatever else they could purchase. The entire point of piracy was immediate reward. So what did pirates actually steal, and how did they convert it into usable wealth? The answer varied depending on what ships they captured. Spanish treasure fleets carrying silver and gold from the Americas to Spain were the ultimate target, but they were heavily guarded and traveled in convoys. Successfully attacking a treasure fleet required either overwhelming force or extraordinary luck, and most pirates had neither. Far more common were attacks on merchant vessels carrying trade goods. A typical merchant ship might be transporting sugar, tobacco, indigo, cotton, lumber, or manufactured goods. Pirates would capture the ship, examine its cargo, and take what they could use or sell. Sugar could be used aboard ship or sold in pirate-friendly ports. Tobacco was valuable and portable. Luxury goods like silk, spices, or wine could be sold for good prices. Less portable goods might be left aboard the ship or sold along with the vessel itself. Pirate tactics evolved to maximize success while minimizing risk. Pirates preferred not to fight if they could avoid it, because combat meant casualties, damage to their ship, and the possibility of losing the prize they were trying to capture. The ideal pirate attack involved intimidating a merchant crew into surrendering without resistance. This is where the infamous pirate flag comes into the story. The Jolly Roger, the black flag with skull and crossbones, wasn't standardized. Different pirate captains used different flags, but most shared common elements: black or red background, symbols of death like skulls, skeletons, or hourglasses, and sometimes weapons like crossed bones, swords, or cutlasses. The purpose was psychological warfare. When a merchant crew saw a pirate flag approaching, they faced a choice: resist and probably die, or surrender and probably be allowed to sail away after being robbed. Many pirates cultivated reputations for cruelty, specifically, to encourage future victims to surrender. If merchant crews believed that a particular pirate captain would torture prisoners who resisted, they'd be more likely to give up immediately. Blackbeard, whom we'll discuss in detail later, was a master of this psychology. He made himself look terrifying with lit fuses burning in his beard during battle, creating an image of a demon from hell. This reputation meant many ships surrendered to him without firing a shot. Pirates also flew false flags to get close to potential targets. International maritime law required ships to fly their nation's flag, but there was no enforcement mechanism on the open ocean. Pirates would approach merchant ships flying English, French, or Spanish flags, whatever would be least likely to alarm their target. Only when they were close enough that the merchant couldn't escape would they raise their pirate flag and demand surrender. The actual attack process was fairly standardized. Pirates preferred fast, maneuverable ships that could overtake and outpace slower merchant vessels. Once they'd identified a target, they'd chase it down. If the merchant ship didn't immediately surrender, pirates would fire a warning shot across the bow. This was an internationally recognized signal: stop, or we'll fire into your ship. Most merchant crews, who weren't paid enough to risk their lives fighting pirates, would stop. If the merchant captain decided to resist, the pirates would attempt to disable the ship without sinking it. They'd aim for the rigging and sails, trying to slow the vessel so they could board it. Sinking the merchant ship would destroy the cargo they wanted to steal, so pirates tried to capture vessels relatively intact. This gave merchant ships a small advantage. If they could outrun or outfight pirates long enough, the pirates would give up and look for easier targets. Boarding was dangerous for both sides. Pirates would bring their ship alongside the merchant vessel, throw grappling hooks to bind the ships together, then swarm aboard. The fighting was brutal and close. Pistols, cutlasses, axes, knives, and improvised weapons. Pirates typically outnumbered merchant crews, giving them a significant advantage. Merchant sailors, faced with overwhelming numbers of armed men who demonstrated their willingness to kill, often surrendered at this point rather than fighting to the death. Once pirates controlled a ship, they'd systematically search it for valuables. They'd force the captain to reveal where money and valuable cargo were stored. They'd search passenger cabins for jewelry, money, or other portable wealth. They'd examine the cargo hold and take what they wanted. Sometimes they'd transfer everything to their own ship. Other times they'd take control of the captured vessel and sail both ships to a friendly port to sell the goods. The treatment of captured crews varied. Pirates had practical reasons to avoid unnecessary killing. Dead men couldn't warn other merchant crews to surrender quickly, and murdering prisoners could turn anti-piracy efforts from routine law enforcement into vengeful crusades. Most pirates would rob a ship, perhaps recruit any sailors who wanted to join them, then let the vessel go with enough supplies to reach port safely. However, pirate mercy wasn't universal or guaranteed. Crews that resisted were sometimes punished brutally as examples. Pirates who felt they'd been treated unfairly in the past. Former sailors who'd been abused by captains or naval officers sometimes took revenge on captured officers. There were documented cases of torture, though these were likely less common than popular stories suggest, because they were shocking enough to be specifically recorded. Converting stolen goods into money required ports where pirates could sell cargo without too many questions. Nassau in the Bahamas became the most famous pirate haven during the Golden Age. Between 1715 and 1718, Nassau was essentially a pirate republic where captured goods could be sold openly. Merchants in Nassau would buy stolen cargo at deeply discounted prices, then ship it to legitimate markets for resale. Everyone profited except the original owners and the governments trying to stop piracy. Pirates spent their money as fast as they acquired it. Contemporary accounts describe pirates arriving in port with pockets full of gold and silver, then drinking, gambling, and celebrating until it was gone. Some pirates would spend months' worth of plunder in a few weeks of debauchery. This wasn't just irresponsible behavior. It reflected the reality that pirates had short life expectancies and uncertain futures. They lived hard because they might not live long. The economics of piracy were actually quite unfavorable for most participants. Successful pirate captains could become wealthy, but ordinary pirates often ended up with modest shares. After dividing plunder according to the ship's articles, paying for supplies, repairing damage, and compensating injured crew members, individual pirates might receive less than they'd earn on a successful merchant voyage. The difference was that pirates received their shares fairly and immediately, whereas merchant sailors were often cheated of their wages. The big score that would make everyone wealthy was rare. Most pirate careers consisted of capturing small merchant vessels carrying modest cargoes, making enough to resupply and continue operations, but never achieving the legendary wealth of stories. The few pirates who did capture Spanish treasure ships or exceptionally valuable prizes became famous precisely because such success was unusual. Piracy was a business, and like any business, it had costs, risks, and occasional rewards. The costs included ship maintenance, provisions, ammunition, and compensation for injured crew. The risks included naval patrols, storms, disease, and the certainty of execution if caught. The rewards were the possibility of wealth and the immediate pleasure of spending whatever they'd managed to steal. For men with limited options in life, it was a business proposition that sometimes made sense, even though the odds weren't particularly good. Imagine a city where the streets are paved with cobblestones purchased with Spanish silver, where taverns never close and no one asks where your money came from, where a man who was robbing ships last week might be drinking next to a merchant who'll buy those stolen goods tomorrow. This was Port Royal, Jamaica, in its prime, and it represented something unique in the Caribbean. A place where the illegal economy of piracy became the foundation of a thriving, if morally questionable, settlement. Port Royal sits at the tip of a long, narrow spit of land stretching into Kingston Harbor. The English captured Jamaica from Spain in 1655, and Port Royal quickly developed as the colony's primary port. Its location was strategically perfect. A natural deep-water harbor that could accommodate large ships, positioned to control access to Jamaica, and convenient to the major Spanish shipping routes through the Caribbean. Initially, it was a modest settlement, but privateers and buccaneers transformed it into something extraordinary. By the 1660s, Port Royal had become the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy. The English government, recognizing that they couldn't effectively defend Jamaica against Spanish retaliation, encouraged privateers to use Port Royal as a base. These privateers, commissioned to attack Spanish ships and settlements, brought their plunder back to Port Royal to sell and spend. The city's economy became entirely dependent on this stolen wealth flowing through its streets. Contemporary descriptions of Port Royal in its heyday are almost hard to believe. One visitor estimated that there were more than 100 taverns in a city of fewer than 6,000 people. One drinking establishment for every 60 residents, including children. The streets were crowded with sailors from a dozen nations, freed and enslaved Africans, merchants, craftsmen, and all the various trades that catered to men with money and short lives. Brothels were numerous and operated openly. Gambling houses ran day and night. The wealth in Port Royal was staggering and highly visible. Pirates who'd captured Spanish treasure would arrive in port with pockets literally full of gold and silver coins. They'd throw money around with abandon, buying drinks for entire taverns, gambling huge sums on dice or cards, and spending lavishly on clothes, weapons, and whatever else caught their fancy. Merchants who'd set up shop in Port Royal became wealthy buying stolen goods at discount, and selling provisions to pirates at inflated prices. But Port Royal wasn't just debauchery and crime. It was also a functioning city with craftsmen, shipwrights, sailmakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and all the various trades necessary to maintain ships and support a port town. Many of these tradesmen were entirely legitimate businesspeople who simply happened to work in a city whose economy ran on piracy. The moral ambiguity was striking. A blacksmith making anchors for pirate ships wasn't committing piracy himself, but he was certainly profiting from it. The diversity of Port Royal's population was remarkable for the 17th century. English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and sailors from various other nations lived side by side. The city had significant populations of free black people who'd escaped slavery, worked off their terms, or simply found freedom in the chaotic environment. Port Royal's essential lawlessness created space for people who wouldn't have been tolerated in more conventional settlements. The city's architecture reflected both its wealth and its priorities. Buildings were constructed quickly from wood with relatively little attention to long-term durability. The focus was on commerce. Warehouses, shops, taverns, and businesses rather than churches or civic buildings. The harbor was lined with wharves where ships could dock and unload their cargoes, legal or otherwise. The whole city was oriented toward the sea and the wealth it brought. The relationship between Port Royal's authorities and the pirates who fueled its economy was complicated. Royal governors were officially supposed to suppress piracy, but they also recognized that the city's prosperity depended on privateers and pirates. Many governors participated directly in the illegal economy, accepting bribes to ignore certain activities or even investing in privateering ventures. The line between law enforcement and complicity was blurry at best. Henry Morgan's career embodied Port Royal's contradictions. As a privateer and later pirate, he'd sacked Spanish cities and brought enormous wealth back to Jamaica. He was celebrated as a hero by Port Royal's residents and the English colonists who benefited from his raids. When political circumstances forced England to prosecute him, he was brought to London, but eventually released and sent back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor with orders to suppress piracy. Morgan, now a respectable official, was responsible for hanging men who'd committed the same acts he'd once performed. Other Caribbean ports served similar functions, though none quite matched Port Royal's scale. Nassau in the Bahamas would become important later during piracy's golden age. Tortuga, as mentioned earlier, had been a Buccaneer stronghold. Various other islands offered safe harbors where pirates could resupply without fear of immediate arrest. These havens shared common characteristics: weak or corrupt government oversight, economic dependence on piracy, and populations that had various reasons to avoid scrutiny from authorities. The economics of pirate havens created interesting dynamics. In legitimate ports, governments taxed trade and regulated commerce. In pirate havens, the taxes were informal. Bribes to officials, inflated prices for goods and services, and the general understanding that everyone needed to participate in the gray market economy for the system to function. This created a kind of lawless order. Crime was the foundation, but within that criminal framework, rules still applied. The sudden end of Port Royal's golden age came, as mentioned earlier, with the 1692 earthquake. The timing seemed almost providential to contemporary religious commentators, who saw it as divine judgment on a wicked city. Whether God's wrath or geological inevitability, the earthquake destroyed most of Port Royal and killed a large portion of its population. The city was partially rebuilt, but it never regained its former prominence or prosperity. After Port Royal's destruction, and as European governments became more serious about suppressing piracy in the late 1690s and early 1700s, pirates found it increasingly difficult to find ports where they could safely resupply and sell their goods. Nassau in the Bahamas filled some of this role during the Golden Age's final years. becoming a pirate republic, where several thousand pirates essentially governed themselves from 1715 to 1718. But Nassau, too, would eventually fall when the British government sent Woodes Rogers as governor with sufficient force to impose order. The loss of safe havens was crucial to piracy's eventual suppression. Pirates needed places to buy provisions, repair ships, sell stolen goods, and recruit new crew members. Without friendly ports, piracy became unsustainable. Ships would wear out without access to shipyards. Crews would run out of supplies. Stolen goods couldn't be converted into usable currency. The elimination of pirate havens was strategic. Cut off pirates' support infrastructure, and piracy itself becomes impossible. Port Royal in its heyday represented a unique moment in Caribbean history, when the line between legitimate commerce and outright piracy became so blurred as to be meaningless. It was a city built on stolen Spanish gold, where former pirates became respectable citizens, where moral judgments were suspended in favor of profit, and where the normal rules of European society simply didn't apply. For a few decades, Port Royal was the wicked heart of Caribbean piracy, and its streets ran with gold. Now we come to the pirates who have achieved legendary status, the captains whose names still resonate 3 centuries after their deaths. These men weren't necessarily the most successful pirates. Some had relatively brief careers, but they captured popular imagination through their personalities, their dramatic exploits, or the ways they embodied what we think pirates should be. Let's meet them. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, is probably history's most famous pirate, and his fame rests largely on his theatrical genius. Teach understood something fundamental about piracy. Reputation could be more valuable than actual fighting ability. If merchant crews were too terrified to resist, battles could be won without firing a shot. So Teach created a persona designed to inspire maximum terror. Blackbeard's appearance was deliberately intimidating. He was tall and powerful, with a long black beard that he'd braid and tie with colored ribbons. During battle, he'd place slow-burning fuses under his hat and in his beard so that his face was wreathed in smoke and flame. Imagine seeing this apparition approaching through gunpowder smoke. A demonic figure with fire literally coming from his face, roaring orders and waving weapons. Many sailors must have believed they were being attacked by the devil himself. Teach's actual pirating career was relatively short, lasting only about 2 years from 1716 to 1718. But during that time, he captured at least 40 ships and became the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. He blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, capturing several vessels and holding the city hostage until his demands were met. He formed brief alliances with other pirates, creating a flotilla powerful enough to threaten major settlements. At his peak, Blackbeard commanded a force of several hundred men across multiple vessels. But Teach's career ended dramatically in November 1718. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy tracked Blackbeard to Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina and engaged him in a fierce battle. Blackbeard fought ferociously, suffering multiple wounds but continuing to fight until Maynard's men finally killed him. According to legend, Blackbeard's body had 5 gunshot wounds and 20 cutlass wounds when he finally died. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from his ship's bowsprit as proof of the infamous pirate's death. Captain William Kidd represents a different kind of pirate story, a tragedy of circumstances and bad luck. Kidd was initially a respectable privateer commissioned by wealthy English investors to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. But Kidd's voyage went badly from the start. His crew became mutinous, demanding he attack ships to provide them with plunder. When Kidd refused, they threatened to leave him. Eventually, facing crew rebellion and financial pressure, Kidd attacked several ships, including some that weren't legitimate targets under his commission. When Kidd returned to the American colonies, he found that the political situation had changed. His sponsors had fallen out of favor, and he was now being portrayed as a pirate rather than a privateer. He was arrested, sent to England for trial, and despite his protests that he'd acted under commission, was convicted of piracy and murder. Kidd was hanged in 1701, and his body was displayed in a cage at Tilbury Point as a warning to other pirates. The irony of Kidd's story is that he wasn't particularly successful as a pirate. He captured relatively few ships and didn't amass the legendary treasure later stories would attribute to him. But his trial was politically motivated and highly publicized, which made him famous. The later legends about Captain Kidd's buried treasure are almost entirely fictional, though Kidd did bury some plunder on Gardiner's Island before his arrest, hoping to use it as a bargaining chip. The treasure was recovered by authorities and used as evidence against him. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. Between 1719 and 1722, he captured over 400 ships, more than any other pirate of his era. Roberts was unusual among pirates. He didn't drink alcohol, he maintained strict discipline, and he was deeply religious, holding prayer services aboard his ship. Yet he was also ruthless, particularly toward ships that resisted or communities that opposed him. Roberts entered piracy somewhat by accident. He was serving as a navigator on a slave ship when it was captured by pirate Captain Howell Davis. Roberts was forced to join the pirates, but quickly proved his competence. When Davis was killed, the crew elected Roberts as their new captain despite his having been a pirate for only 6 weeks. Roberts accepted, allegedly saying that since he'd been forced into piracy anyway, he might as well make the most of it. Roberts developed a distinctive style. He wore expensive clothes, favoring a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, with a red feather in his hat and a diamond-encrusted cross on a gold chain. He created elaborate flags, including one showing himself standing on skulls representing his enemies. His ship's articles, mentioned earlier, were among the most detailed pirate codes that survive. Roberts ran his ships with professional efficiency, rare among pirates. Roberts' career ended when the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow caught up with him in February 1722 off the coast of West Africa. Roberts was killed early in the battle by grape shot to the throat. His crew, following his wishes, threw his body overboard rather than letting it be captured. Without Roberts' leadership, his crew quickly surrendered. Most were hanged, though some were acquitted or transported. Roberts' death marked a significant moment in the decline of Golden Age piracy. Henry Morgan, mentioned earlier, deserves fuller treatment here. Morgan was the most successful of the Buccaneers, leading raids against Spanish settlements in the Caribbean during the 1660s and 1670s. His attack on Panama City in 1671 was one of the most audacious operations in pirate history. He led about 1,400 men across the Isthmus of Panama through jungle and swamp, then captured and sacked one of Spain's most important American cities. Morgan's genius was organizational. He could coordinate large forces, plan complex operations, and maintain discipline among the notoriously independent-minded Buccaneers. His raids combined naval power with land combat, using captured ships to transport men for assaults on fortified cities. He understood both tactics and strategy, knowing when to attack, when to negotiate, and when to retreat. Morgan's transformation from pirate to respectable knight and colonial administrator embodies the ambiguous status of piracy during this era. The same actions that made him a criminal in Spanish eyes made him a hero in English ones. His later role in suppressing piracy showed how former pirates could become effective anti-piracy forces because they understood pirate tactics and thinking. Morgan died wealthy and respected in 1688, having successfully transitioned from buccaneer to establishment figure. These captains represent different aspects of pirate mythology. Blackbeard embodied theatrical terror and demonic violence. Kidd showed how circumstances could transform a respectable privateer into a condemned pirate. Roberts proved that pirates could be professional and successful while maintaining personal codes of conduct. Morgan demonstrated how piracy and legitimate politics could blur together when national interests aligned with individual ambition. Their stories have been retold and embellished for centuries, but even the documented facts are remarkable. These were extraordinary individuals who chose lives of violence and uncertainty, achieved temporary fame and wealth, and left legacies that far outlasted their brief careers. They weren't heroes, but they weren't simple villains either. They were complex people navigating a complex world, and their choices shaped Caribbean history in ways that still resonate today. The popular image of pirates is overwhelmingly male: bearded captains, rough sailors, and masculine violence. But women participated in piracy throughout history, though their stories were often forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Some disguised themselves as men to join crews. Others commanded their own ships openly. A few built pirate empires that rivaled any male pirate's achievements. Let's explore these remarkable women who refused to accept society's limitations. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous female pirates of the Caribbean, and their stories are intertwined. Both were women who disguised themselves as men to escape limited options and pursue lives of adventure and freedom. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 1700, the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy lawyer and his maid. Her father eventually moved the family to Charleston, South Carolina, where Anne grew up with more freedom than most women of her era. Anne married a small-time pirate named James Bonny and moved to Nassau, the pirate haven in the Bahamas. But she found her husband disappointingly unambitious, and when she met John Calico Jack Rackham, a more charismatic pirate captain, she left her husband to sail with Rackham. Anne dressed as a man to avoid drawing attention, though according to some accounts, her true sex was known to at least some of the crew. Mary Read had a more complicated path to piracy. Born in England, her mother had dressed her as a boy from childhood to deceive relatives into providing financial support for what they believed was a male heir. Mary grew up living as a man, eventually joining the military and serving in Flanders. She married a soldier, revealing her true sex to him, and they ran an inn together. But when he died, Mary resumed male disguise and signed aboard a ship bound for the West Indies. Mary's ship was captured by pirates, and she joined the crew, still disguised as a man. Eventually, she ended up on Calico Jack Rackham's ship, where she met Anne Bonny. According to the stories, Anne was initially attracted to this handsome young sailor before discovering Mary's true sex. The two women became close friends and fierce fighters, both known for their courage in battle. Contemporary accounts of Anne and Mary's trial emphasized their fighting ability. Witnesses testified that during their ship's capture by pirate hunters, Anne and Mary were among the few crew members who actively resisted. Most of Rackham's crew, including Rackham himself, hid below deck during the fight. Anne and Mary stayed on deck, fighting with pistols and cutlasses, cursing their cowardly male crew members for their lack of courage. When they were captured and tried for piracy in Jamaica in 1720, both women revealed they were pregnant, which saved them from immediate execution under English law, which didn't execute pregnant women. Mary Read died in prison, likely from fever, before she could be hanged. Anne Bonny's fate is less certain. There's no record of her execution, and some historians believe her wealthy father may have arranged for her release. She disappears from historical record after the trial, and we don't know what became of her. The stories of Anne and Mary raise interesting questions about gender and piracy. Were they accepted by their male crew members? Contemporary accounts suggest yes, though this might reflect more about the democratic and unconventional nature of pirate society than about gender equality generally. Pirates cared about competence and courage more than conventional social status. If a woman could fight and work like any man, many pirates apparently didn't care about her sex. But the most successful female pirate in history came from China, not the Caribbean. Zheng Yisao commanded a fleet of over 300 junks and somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 pirates at her peak, making her the most powerful pirate leader of any gender in world history. Her story shows that under the right circumstances, women could achieve power and respect, even in the male-dominated world of piracy. Zheng Yisao was born Shiyang around 1775 and worked on a floating brothel before marrying Zheng Yi, a powerful pirate captain. When Zheng Yi died in 1807, Zheng Yisao maneuvered to maintain control of his fleet. She formed an alliance with her late husband's right-hand man and adopted son, Zheng Bao, who she later married. But make no mistake, Zheng Yisao was the power behind the throne, the strategist who transformed a collection of pirate gangs into a disciplined fleet. Zheng Yisao established strict rules for her fleet. Pirates had to register all captured goods and distribute them according to precise formulas. Those who sexually assaulted captives would be executed. Those who took unauthorized shore leave would have their ears cut off. Deserters would be hunted down and killed. She ran her pirate confederation like a naval organization, with clear chains of command, regular communication between ships, and standardized procedures. This organization made her forces far more effective than typical pirates. Her fleet dominated the South China Sea, extracting protection money from fishing fleets and coastal villages, capturing merchant ships, and sometimes even fighting Chinese government forces. The Qing dynasty government tried repeatedly to defeat her, but Zheng Yisao's fleet was too large, too well-organized, and too mobile. Naval expeditions sent against her were defeated or avoided. The government's inability to control their own coastline was humiliating. In 1810, recognizing that the government was offering increasingly generous terms for pirates to accept amnesty, Zheng Yisao negotiated a remarkably favorable surrender. She received a noble title, was allowed to keep a substantial fleet, 70 junks, and her husband Zheng Bao received a position in the Chinese military. Most of her followers were pardoned and allowed to keep their plunder. Zheng Yisao had essentially won. She retired wealthy, respected, and with official government position. She lived comfortably until her death in 1844, running a gambling house in Canton. Few pirates of any gender achieved such a successful retirement. Grace O'Malley, an Irish pirate of the 16th century, commanded her own ships and maintained her own fleet off Ireland's west coast. Born into a family of seafarers, Grace inherited her father's ships and continued the family business of trading, fishing, and occasional piracy. She married twice, both times strategically, and allegedly included in her marriage contracts the provision that she could keep her ships and income. Grace commanded her fleet personally, leading raids against both English ships and rival Irish clans. She met Queen Elizabeth I in 1593, negotiating directly with the English monarch as one ruler to another. The meeting between these two powerful women, one ruling an empire, the other commanding a pirate fleet, must have been remarkable, though unfortunately, no detailed account survives. Grace died around 1603, having spent her life defying both gender expectations and English authority. These women succeeded in piracy through different strategies. Some, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, disguised themselves as men and proved they could fight as well as any male pirate. Others, like Zheng Yisao and Grace O'Malley, used their actual identities, but commanded respect through competence, ruthlessness, and political acumen. All of them challenged contemporary assumptions about what women could do and who could wield power. The existence of female pirates raises questions about why they're less well known than their male counterparts. Part of the answer is that there were fewer of them. Piracy was predominantly a male profession. But part is also that history has often overlooked or deliberately forgotten women who transgressed gender boundaries so dramatically. Stories about female pirates were often portrayed as curiosities or oddities, rather than as evidence that women could be just as capable, ruthless, and successful as men in this dangerous profession. These women weren't feminists in any modern sense. They weren't fighting for women's rights or trying to change society. They were individuals seeking freedom, wealth, and adventure in one of the few spaces where competence could overcome gender discrimination. But their existence proved something important: that courage, leadership, and skill have no gender, and that women could thrive even in environments as dangerous and male-dominated as piracy. By the early 1720s, European governments had finally had enough. The golden age of piracy, which had flourished in the chaos following the War of Spanish Succession, was costing too much in lost trade, disrupted commerce, and damaged prestige. Pirates had become bold enough to blockade major ports and attack ships within sight of colonial capitals. Something had to be done, and governments had finally developed both the will and the means to suppress piracy systematically. The shift in official attitudes toward piracy was driven by multiple factors. As European nations made peace with each other, privateering became less useful. The economic disruption pirates caused to all nations, commerce outweighed any advantages from allowing privateers to raid enemy shipping. The growth of colonial economies made secure maritime trade more valuable. And frankly, pirates had become embarrassingly powerful, demonstrating that governments couldn't protect their own citizens or commerce in waters they claimed to control. The campaign against piracy required both military force and legal innovation. On the military side, European nations began deploying more warships specifically to hunt pirates. These ships were faster and better armed than typical pirate vessels, and their crews were trained for combat rather than commerce raiding. The Royal Navy in particular became increasingly effective at tracking down and destroying pirate ships during the 1720s. But hunting pirates in the vast Caribbean and Atlantic required more than just firepower. It required intelligence networks, cooperation between colonies, and systematic patrols of known pirate havens. The British government established colonial vice-admiralty courts that could try pirates quickly without sending them back to England. This made prosecution more efficient and served as a more immediate deterrent. One of the most effective anti-piracy initiatives was the offer of pardons. In 1717 and 1718, the British government proclaimed that any pirate who surrendered would receive a full pardon for past crimes. This split pirate communities, with some men accepting the opportunity to retire safely while others continued pirating. The pardons weakened pirate fleets and provided useful intelligence as former pirates shared information about continuing pirates' locations and plans. Woodes Rogers' governorship of Nassau exemplified the systematic approach to eliminating piracy. Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718 with both a royal pardon to offer pirates and sufficient military force to compel those who refused. He gave pirates a choice: accept the pardon and become law-abiding citizens, or be hunted down and hanged. Many pirates, weary of the dangerous life and recognizing that piracy's golden age was ending, accepted the pardon. But Rogers backed diplomacy with force. He fortified Nassau, established a militia, and worked with Royal Navy ships to patrol Bahamian waters. When some pirates rejected the pardon and continued operating, Rogers hunted them down systematically. He hanged captured pirates publicly, sending a clear message about the consequences of continuing piracy. Within a year, Rogers had transformed Nassau from a pirate haven into a reasonably orderly colonial town. The legal campaign against piracy was equally important. Pirates had traditionally been tried under Admiralty law, which required witnesses and evidence that were often difficult to obtain for crimes committed at sea. But new laws allowed for more streamlined prosecution. The Piracy Act of 1721 made piracy explicitly a capital crime and simplified the evidence required for conviction. Captured pirates could be tried quickly, and hanged within weeks of their capture. The executions were deliberately public and theatrical. Pirates were typically hanged at locations visible from the water, like Execution Dock in London, so that passing sailors would see the bodies. The bodies were often left hanging in gibbets, metal cages that held the corpse, as long-term warnings. Some famous pirates like Captain Kidd and William Fly were displayed this way for years, their decomposing bodies serving as grim reminders of piracy's consequences. These public executions served multiple purposes. They demonstrated government power and resolve. They provided a spectacle that drew large crowds, turning the execution into a form of public entertainment. And they sent clear messages to sailors considering piracy that the crime would be severely punished. Many of the condemned pirates made speeches before execution, and these were often recorded and published, creating a literature of pirate confession that both entertained and instructed. The most effective pirate hunters combined military skill with understanding of pirate tactics. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, who killed Blackbeard, succeeded by using deception. Knowing that Blackbeard's ship had deeper draft than his smaller vessels, Maynard lured Blackbeard into shallow water where the pirate's ship ran aground. He also hid most of his men below decks, making Blackbeard think he faced a smaller force than actually opposed him. When Blackbeard boarded Maynard's ship expecting easy victory, Maynard's hidden men emerged and overwhelmed the pirates. Woodes Rogers and other effective anti-piracy governors understood that eliminating piracy required addressing its economic foundations. Rogers worked to provide legitimate employment opportunities in Nassau, encouraging fishing, salvage operations, and legal trade. By giving former pirates alternatives to piracy, he made the straight life more attractive. This pragmatic approach recognized that pure law enforcement couldn't succeed if poverty and lack of opportunity drove men back to piracy. The elimination of pirate havens was crucial. Without safe ports to resupply, sell goods, and recruit crew, piracy became unsustainable. The British government focused on establishing effective administration in formerly lawless territories. Nassau, previously a pirate republic, became a proper colony with a garrison, courts, and functioning government. Other Caribbean islands received increased attention and resources. Pirates found fewer and fewer places where they could safely operate. The shift in merchant shipping practices also made piracy more difficult. Merchants began arming their vessels more heavily, hiring larger crews, and traveling in convoys when possible. Naval escorts protected particularly valuable cargoes. Insurance companies offered better rates to ships that took precautions against piracy, creating economic incentives for defensive measures. These practices made piracy more dangerous and less profitable. By 1726, the golden age of piracy was effectively over. The last major pirate captains had been killed or captured. The pirate havens had been brought under government control. The economic disruption of constant warfare had ended, making piracy less attractive and governments more able to commit resources to suppressing it. Pirates still existed, but they were hunted criminals rather than semi-legitimate operators in gray legal zones. The methods used to suppress piracy: military force combined with legal reforms, offers of pardons paired with credible threats of execution, elimination of support infrastructure, and provision of alternatives to piracy, proved remarkably effective. Within about a decade, European governments transformed the Caribbean from waters where pirates operated openly to seas where piracy was rare and dangerous. It was a comprehensive victory that showed what organized state power could accomplish when fully committed to a goal. The end of the golden age of piracy wasn't the end of all piracy, of course. Pirates would continue operating in various parts of the world for centuries, but never again would pirates achieve the level of power, independence, and notoriety that Caribbean pirates enjoyed in the early 18th century. That brief period when pirates could challenge national governments, blockade major ports, and create their own floating republics was over, ended by the determined application of state power against men who dared to live outside the law. The last major Caribbean pirate was executed in 1726, but in a very real sense, pirates never died. They simply moved from the seas into our stories, transformed from criminals who disrupted trade into romantic figures who represented freedom and adventure. This transformation of pirates from feared felons to beloved cultural icons is one of history's most interesting exercises in collective memory and cultural mythology. How did we get from the brutal reality of 18th century piracy to Johnny Depp's comedic Captain Jack Sparrow? The romanticization of pirates began almost immediately after their suppression. In the 1720s and 1730s, even as pirates were being hanged, books appeared that collected and embellished pirate stories. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, became the definitive source for pirate lore. Johnson, whose real identity remains debated, collected stories about famous pirates, adding dramatic details and moral lessons. His book shaped how subsequent generations would understand and imagine piracy. Johnson's accounts mixed fact and fiction liberally. He accurately recorded many historical details, but also embellished stories to make them more entertaining. He added dialogue, created dramatic scenes, and sometimes invented incidents entirely. But his book became so influential that later historians would struggle to separate Johnson's inventions from historical fact. The pirates we think we know are often partly Johnson's fictional creations. The 19th century saw pirates fully transformed into romantic figures. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson created pirate adventures that emphasized excitement and treasure over historical accuracy. Treasure Island, published in 1883, established many elements that became standard in pirate fiction. Treasure maps, buried gold, tropical islands, and the one-legged pirate with a parrot, Long John Silver. Stevenson's pirates were villains, but fascinating villains, complex characters rather than simple criminals. Stevenson's novel was enormously influential, establishing the template for pirate stories that followed. The quest for buried treasure became central to pirate narratives, despite the historical reality that pirates almost never buried treasure. The image of pirates as treasure seekers, rather than commerce raiders, proved more appealing to readers. Treasure maps with X marking the spot, pirates fighting over chests of gold, and desperate searches for hidden wealth became standard elements of pirate fiction. The early 20th century brought pirates to film, and cinema transformed them again. Douglas Fairbanks' 1926 film, The Black Pirate, established many visual elements we associate with pirates. Dramatic sword fights, swinging from rigging, and acrobatic combat on ship decks. These films weren't interested in historical accuracy, but in creating exciting adventure. They portrayed pirates as dashing rogues rather than brutal criminals, emphasizing their charm and courage over their violence and theft. Errol Flynn's 1935 film, Captain Blood, further solidified the romantic pirate image. Flynn played a wrongfully convicted doctor who becomes a pirate, but retains his nobility and honor. This gentleman pirate trope, based loosely on historical figures like Stede Bonnet, a wealthy landowner who became a pirate, allowed audiences to enjoy pirate adventures without moral complications. These pirates weren't criminals. They were heroes forced into piracy by unjust circumstances. The mid-20th century saw pirate imagery become increasingly sanitized and family-friendly. Disney's theme park ride Pirates of the Caribbean, which opened in 1967, presented pirates as jolly, singing drunks rather than dangerous criminals. The ride's pirates were comedic figures, bumbling through their attempts at wickedness. This G-rated version of piracy removed all genuine threat, creating pirates who were fun rather than frightening. Children's media adopted pirates enthusiastically. Peter Pan's Captain Hook became a standard villain in children's entertainment, a pirate who was more silly than scary. Pirate-themed toys, Halloween costumes, and birthday parties became common. Talk Like a Pirate Day became a joke holiday. Pirates were transformed into cartoon characters, appropriate entertainment for young children, completely disconnected from the historical reality of murder, theft, and violence. But interestingly, serious pirate media continued to exist alongside these sanitized versions. The 1990s saw more morally complex pirate stories. Books like Tim Powers' On Stranger Tides combined historical piracy with fantasy elements, creating pirates who were neither heroes nor simple villains, but complex characters navigating difficult circumstances. This novel would later influence the Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise. The Pirates of the Caribbean film series, beginning in 2003, represented another transformation of pirate mythology. Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow was neither the romantic hero of Errol Flynn films nor the comedic buffoon of earlier Disney material, but something new. A trickster figure, cunning and cowardly by turns, motivated primarily by self-preservation, but capable of occasional heroism. Sparrow's ambiguity, neither fully good nor fully evil, made him more interesting than traditional pirate characters. The film's commercial success demonstrated continued cultural fascination with pirates. They combined action, comedy, romance, and fantasy, using historical piracy as a loose framework for adventure stories. The films took tremendous liberties with history. Their pirates use fantasy elements like cursed treasure and supernatural creatures. But they captured something essential about piracy's appeal: the promise of freedom from social constraints and the adventure of living outside society's rules. Modern pirate video games like Assassin's Creed IV, Black Flag have created new ways to experience pirate mythology. These games allow players to command pirate ships, engage in naval combat, and explore Caribbean waters. They're more historically accurate than many earlier pirate media, including realistic sailing mechanics and period-appropriate equipment. But they still romanticize piracy, presenting it as exciting adventure rather than the often brutal and short-lived reality it actually was. The evolution of pirate imagery in popular culture reveals changing cultural values and anxieties. Early post-Golden Age pirate stories emphasized the evil of piracy and the justice of pirates' execution, serving as moral lessons. Victorian pirate stories reflected colonial adventure and the romance of exotic locations. Mid-20th century pirates became safe, family entertainment, stripped of genuine threat. Modern pirate stories often explore themes of freedom, resistance to authority, and living outside social norms. Pirates have become useful symbols because they exist outside normal society. They can represent freedom from constraints, resistance to authority, or simple lawlessness, depending on the story's needs. This flexibility makes them endlessly reusable in different contexts and genres. Pirates can be heroes, villains, comedic figures, or romantic leads. They can appear in historical dramas, fantasies, children's entertainment, or serious examinations of colonial history. What's been lost in this cultural evolution is the reality of historical piracy. The violence, the short life expectancies, the disease, the harsh living conditions, and the fact that most pirates were desperate men with limited options rather than romantic adventurers seeking freedom. The real pirates would likely be baffled and perhaps amused by their transformation into beloved cultural figures. They were thieves and murderers, and while some were certainly charismatic and some did create surprisingly democratic communities, they weren't heroes. But perhaps that's inevitable. Historical accuracy rarely makes for compelling entertainment, and the reality of piracy, mostly boring routine punctuated by brief moments of violence, doesn't translate well to film or literature. We've taken the kernel of historical truth, that pirates really existed, really sailed Caribbean waters, really rebelled against authority, and built elaborate fantasies around it. The pirates of popular culture aren't historical figures. They're mythological ones, shaped by centuries of storytelling into something that serves our need for adventure, freedom, and rebellion against constraint. The pirate flag still flies in popular imagination, not because real pirates were admirable, but because the idea of pirates, freedom, adventure, living by your own rules, appeals to something deep in human nature. We've transformed brutal maritime criminals into symbols of freedom, and in doing so, we've created our own mythology, one that tells us more about our dreams than about historical reality. Tonight, we've sailed through centuries of salt spray and legend. Pirates weren't the romantic heroes of our stories. They were thieves and murderers, desperate men who chose violence and uncertainty over grinding poverty and oppression. But they were also people who created something unique. Democratic communities aboard their ships, codes that recognized every person's equal worth, and lives lived entirely on their own terms. For a brief moment in history, the freest people in the Atlantic world were outlaws flying black flags, and their legacy, however romanticized, still captures our imagination centuries after the last pirate captain walked the plank or swung from the gallows. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the age of pirates. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find adventure in your dreams, freedom in your rest, and the courage to chart your own course through whatever seas you sail.